All right, so welcome to Reason and Rationality, a summer program where high school students learn about philosophy, economics, politics, ethics, and much more besides through lively and cordial discussion. We're here for the summer 2025 program at Princeton University, and we're going to be hosting a kind of discussion-style debate on whether God exists. But before I get some preliminaries on the table for that, maybe we should just introduce ourselves, our panelists, as it were. So, I'm Joe Schmid. I'm a third-year PhD student here at Princeton University in the philosophy program. I study metaphysics, so like the fundamental nature and structure of reality, philosophy of religion, and a bit of metaethics sprinkled in there as well. So that's a little bit about me.
Yeah. My name is Flo Backus. I am currently a fifth-year PhD student in the Department of Philosophy at Harvard. My research mainly focuses on the foundations of ethics, especially Immanuel Kant's moral theory, and I also have interest in decision theory.
I'm Noah McKay. I'm an incoming PhD student in the philosophy department at Princeton University, and I'm interested in epistemology, which is the study of knowledge and rational belief, metaphysics, and also metaethics.
All right, so a bit of preliminaries before we get the discussion-style debate going. First, don't infer anything about our actual beliefs from what we're going to be saying up here tonight. We sort of collectively agreed to assign ourselves different roles or different positions within this debate. We each can actually capably defend, at least in our view, we can capably defend each of the positions on offer on the table here. So if someone is defending the atheist worldview or the theist worldview or is being an agnostic, don't infer their actual positions from that. So that's one thing that I want to say. There will hopefully also be a Q&A, which will not be included in the finished product. So it's good. Cut out the Q&A. Don't worry about that. Have as much intellectual courage to ask anything you want. So it's not going to be included in the finished product. It's not going to be seen anywhere but this room. Also, during the Q&A, we will respond, with the views that we've been assigned and defending them as best as we can. In terms of the structure, really it's a discussion-style informal debate. We're just hoping to show you how maybe grad students would, and just philosophers, think about and reason about these topics together as if they're in just like the student lounge and debating these things. So we're giving you a kind of live glimpse into that. There'll be 75 minutes of discussion among us instructors, and then like the 45-minute Q&A. So a little bit about our debate topic. So the question is, does God exist? We should say here what kind of conception of God we're working with. We'll primarily be operating with a pretty popular philosophical conception of God as a perfect being who is all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good, and who created the universe. So that's the kind of generic conception of God that we're going to be working with primarily in our discussion today. We're not going to be arguing for or against any particular religion, although this philosophical conception of God is, of course, common to many world religions like Christianity, Islam, Judaism, versions of Hinduism, and several other world religions. So I don't know if you guys want to say anything for preliminaries, or do we just want to get into it?
I say we get started.
Okay, so Noah, you're going to be the theist today. I'm going to be an atheist, and Flo's going to be an agnostic. So I'll just briefly define that. So as we're going to be using those terms, a theist is someone who believes that God exists. They say, yeah, God exists. They assent to that proposition. An atheist, as we're going to be using it today, is someone who believes that God doesn't exist. They assent to the proposition that there is no God. An agnostic suspends judgment on the question. They withhold their belief. They don't believe that God exists, but they also don't believe that God doesn't exist. Maybe they think the evidence is roughly counterbalanced. Maybe they think we can't know, and so we shouldn't form a belief one way or the other. But that's what an agnostic is for our purposes. Anything to add about that?
Sounds good to me.
Okay, so Noah, why should we believe in God?
Oh, man. Well, there are lots of reasons. Maybe dozens of arguments I could give, but maybe I'll stick to three. I'll start with what's sometimes called the contingency argument, or the cosmological argument. And here's how the argument goes. It seems like the physical universe is a contingent being. That is to say, the physical universe could have failed to exist. But if the physical universe could have failed to exist, it seems like there must be some explanation for the fact that it exists rather than not existing, right? Why is there a physical universe if there could have failed to be one? And the explanation for the existence of the contingent physical universe can't itself be contingent, or at least that can't be the end of the explanation, right? Because if the explanation was itself contingent, then that means it also could have failed to exist. So we would need some further explanation for why that thing exists rather than not existing. So it seems like the ultimate explanation of the existence of contingent reality has to be a necessary being. That is, a being that couldn't possibly have failed to exist, a being that must exist. And that being can't be a part of contingent reality because it's supposed to explain contingent reality. Contingent reality can't explain itself. So this thing must transcend the physical world, and it has to be enormously powerful, right? To create all this, the whole cosmos, all of space-time. You might even think that the necessary being that explains the existence of contingent reality is limitless in power. Why think that it's limitless in power? Well, imagine it was limited in power, and its power went up to like just this degree and no further. That'd be kind of weird. That would be like arbitrary. I mean, imagine I told you, look, I have a rival hypothesis. It's a rival to the contemporary conception of the laws of physics. According to my theory, the laws of physics apply everywhere except for one tiny little cubic inch in the Andromeda galaxy. Just that part of the universe, that's not governed by the laws of physics. You might think, that's weird. Like, why does physics apply everywhere else but not in that one spot? And you say the same thing if I said, like, oh, a third of the universe is governed by different laws of physics. Again, that just sort of seems arbitrary and random. So it seems like the most elegant explanation of the existence of contingent reality is going to be a necessary being whose power is unlimited. Now, I realize we haven't quite gotten to the traditional conception of God, but we're part of the way there, right? I mean, if it turned out God exists, that would be a really good candidate explanation for the existence of contingent reality, right? Because God is, I mean, among other things, a necessary being who has the power, limitless power, to create anything, including all of this. What do you think about that? You find that compelling?
Yeah, interesting. So it seems to me like the argument is occurring in two sort of like stages. On the one hand, you say there's all this contingent stuff, and on the other, and then from that, you say that there has to be a necessary being in order to explain the contingent stuff. And then in your second stage, you're arguing that that necessary thing is God, right? Am I understanding correctly?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, let's say I grant the first stage. So let's say I agree that, yeah, contingent things have to have an explanation for why they are the way they are, because they could have been different. So, but it seems like even if I grant that, I don't have to grant that necessary thing that explains all the contingent things is God. I can think of sort of like, various other examples of possible necessary beings that explain all the contingency in reality. For one, like it seems like the necessary being could be physical itself. Like, maybe the quantum mechanical wave function of the whole universe is a necessary being. And all the contingent nature of reality is just sort of like grounded in the nature of this wave function. Something like that.
What do you mean by grounded?
Oh, yeah, by grounded in, I mean sort of like it's the way it is the way it is because the wave function has a certain nature.
So it's dependent on it somewhere.
Yeah, so it's like dependent on it, and then the nature of this necessary being explains the contingent things. And, even if there's sort of some reason to think that like the necessary being can't be physical, it seems to me that there are even examples of possible candidate necessary beings that are just not God, because God is not just an immaterial necessary being. Rather, God is in addition some kind of intelligence, all-powerful, all-good, all-knowing. So, one example, for example, is, I know this view called axiarchism, which I think holds that the good is the fundamental source of reality. And it's sort of like what governs everything, what explains why everything is the way it is that it is best for those things to be that way. So to break it down, it's sort of like the most fundamental and necessary thing is like the principle of goodness that governs all reality, right? And so what explains why, contingent things are the way they are, why there's this many stars in our galaxy, etc., is that it's best for ways to be that way. And, it might seem implausible to say that things are the best way they could possibly be, but at least you also have to accept that if God exists.
Interesting.
That seems pretty forceful. You have any responses, Noah?
Yeah, so those are some good suggestions. I'm not a physicist, so I don't know a lot about wave functions. But it seems to me like if you want to say that the necessary being is the universal wave function, I would kind of want to know, why does the wave function why does it take on the particular values that it takes on rather than any other particular values? I mean, think about what reality must have been like, physical reality, at like the first moment after the Big Bang, right? There are going to be lots of sort of just facts about that state of affairs that could have been very different. Like, maybe the laws of nature could have been a little bit different. As we'll talk about maybe later, maybe some of the forces between particles could have been a little bit different. Maybe there could have been a different amount of matter. And it just seems a little bit strange for the necessary being to have arbitrary features, arbitrary limits like that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Because like in quantum mechanics, it's like the evolution of the wave function is governed by Schrodinger's equation, but it's still dependent upon what the initial conditions are. And so you're saying that proposal doesn't still like eliminate that contingency.
Oh, yeah, I see. Right. So now we want to know, why, if the initial conditions are themselves contingent, we might have to explain why they have the features they do.
Well, can I say something about that as well?
Yeah.
So, I mean, you're pinpointing certain seemingly arbitrary features of the universal wave function or what have you. I mean, there are two potential responses to that. One is that, Flo was just giving one potential example of a candidate physical necessary being. We don't have to go with Flo's example. We might propose others which are perhaps less arbitrary. So, Democritus, of course, posited like these itty-bitty, indivisible, simple particles whose various motions and rearrangements just explain the variegated diversity of things and all of contingent reality. So we might suppose that, fundamentally there are, simple particles or maybe simple strings or something which is simpler or less arbitrary than a universal wave function. So that's one potential response. Like, even if that proposal faces problems, there are other ways that you could have a necessary being which isn't physical. That's one response. A second response, well, maybe I should turn it over to you to engage with that.
Yeah, I like that suggestion. I do worry a little bit that if we're trying to explain the existence of contingent reality by reference to many things, like lots of little strings and lots of little particles, that might be a less simple explanation than positing one thing, just like a limitless mind or a perfect agent, right? We would have to ask questions like, why are there just that many strings or just that many particles?
Maybe we could propose, you were mentioning like arbitrary limits. There's some sort of finite cutoff, which seems arbitrary. Maybe we can just propose some kind of plenitudinous picture where all the possible fundamental simple particles or strings that could exist do exist. A very simple principle, and it delivers a kind of variety of simple fundamental entities. It seems like the diversity is explained in terms of a kind of unity, or uniformity, and I don't know, that's exactly what you were doing in the case of theism.
Oh, interesting. So the idea is that, are you thinking there are like infinitely many of these little particles, or?
Yeah, perhaps spread out in a vast multiverse or what have you.
Oh, I see.
Well, that's one possibility, but another possibility is just that the actual universe is, infinite, and that's the case.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'll have to think more about that. Would you mind if I moved on to?
I do have. Well, can I give the second objection because I think it's interesting?
Okay. But can I say something maybe about axiarchism?
Yeah. And then we'll come back. We'll come back to that.
Yes. Yeah. So this idea that there's let me make sure I understand your view correctly. Axiarchism just says that what explains the existence of contingent reality and the features of contingent reality is that this is the best way for reality to be. Is that roughly the idea? Yes. Okay. I think that if that's true, then God might exist. Well, because God's a perfect person. And can you imagine anything better than the existence of a perfect being like God? Now, this is kind of weird because if that's what I say, then I got to go back on my claim that God is the fundamental being.
Right, because he seems to be dependent on this.
Right, yeah.
Universal.
There is, it's not that God is contingent, but there is like some further explanation for why he exists. It's that necessarily things are the best way they could be, and the best way for them to be is for God to exist. So that's kind of cool. That's sort of a weird version of, when I say a weird version of theism, I mean one that I haven't really thought about before and that I haven't heard talked much about before. So, yeah, I'll have to think more about that too.
Yeah. I mean, I guess if I were to respond to this, I might just wonder whether, whether we could support the claim that it really is a better way for things to be, for there to be a God, not assuming that God necessarily exists. But I really want to hear what you were going to say about.
Yeah, no, I mean, the second response that I was going to give to your arbitrariness point with respect to the wave function, going back to that point. And again, I mean, just to make sure we're all tracking, like, Noah gave an argument which breaks down into two different stages, right? The first stage looks at the world. We see various things that can fail to exist. They don't have to be in reality, the way that 1 + 1 has to equal 2. So, I didn't have to exist if my parents hadn't met. There are various contingent things. And Noah said, like, hey, it seems like we need some kind of explanation for contingent things because they could have failed to exist. So why do they exist? And when we look around, we see that contingent things uniformly have explanations. Trees come about as a result of prior causes. Same with any other contingent thing in our experience. So that's a kind of part of the first stage. And then you go on to say, well, what could explain the existence of contingent things? It can't be something contingent because that's precisely what we're trying to seek an explanation of. So we got to explain it in terms of something that's necessary, that cannot fail to exist. It must exist in the same way that 1 + 1 must equal 2. And then Noah tried, so that's the first stage of reasoning. The second stage of reasoning that Noah was giving was that, hey, this thing that must exist has various suspiciously godlike features, and God seems to be maybe the best candidate for that. And the way that the way that Flo pushed back against that was saying, like, hey, it actually seems like maybe there are lots of other candidates that could be equally good explanations for the existence of contingent reality that aren't actually God, that are instead perhaps friendly to an atheistic picture of reality. And you mentioned that, well, some of the candidates that you proposed, Flo, were kind of arbitrary. I said, well, hey, maybe we can get some other kinds of candidates. I'm just tracing out the dialectic for you so that we can resituate ourselves to kind of get into what my second objection was. So my second objection to that point about arbitrariness was, well, we might think that God seems to have, at least on its face, certain seemingly arbitrary features. So God has a certain degree of, or certain strength of desire to create certain things, right? Like, God doesn't have just like this maximal infinite strength of desire to create, like, I don't know, something, to pick something that doesn't exist, right? Because clearly he didn't make it. Or like, it seems like God would have a stronger desire to make humans than to make something else, some like random particle in the Andromeda galaxy, because we're more valuable. So like, God seems to have differing degrees of desire that track the different values that things have. Like, God would want better things more than he wants things that are worse. Right? So God also has these different features, like some are higher strength than others, some are lower strength and whatnot. Now, the way that you might respond to this is, of course, to say, well, there's like some sort of deeper explanation in terms of God's nature. Like, those are the strengths of desires that a perfect being would have because those track the values of things, and that seems to be a kind of appropriate thing for a perfect being to have in terms of how strong its desires are. But then we can just turn around and give the same reason or same response on behalf of like the universal wave function. Those particular arbitrary features that you were mentioning, like why that strength of, the electron field or whatever, maybe it just flows from some deeper fact about the universal wave function's nature in precisely the same way that you mentioned with God. And maybe we may not be able to tease that out kind of from the armchair, but you also can't like tease out what the exact values of God's or strengths of God's desires would be from the armchair. So I do think there's perhaps a kind of parity here, and it's not clear to me that we've really established God's existence.
What if I said something like this? In God's case, there actually is a pretty good explanation about, in terms of God's underlying nature for the things that he does. Maybe I can say, look, what is God most fundamentally? Well, he's a perfect being. So God's nature boils down to perfection. or maybe greatness. Maybe God is the greatest possible being. And from that, I might be able to explain some of the other various features of his, like, well, why is he unlimited in power? Well, because it's better to have limitless power than to have limited power. And of course, it's better to have some power than no power at all. I can say he knows everything. Why? Well, because knowledge is good. A perfect being would have some knowledge, and they would have all of it. And then I can say, well, this is why God necessarily exists, is because it's better for a being to be such that it couldn't fail to exist, right? It's got like a super strong grip on reality, as someone once put it to me. Yeah. And then you might think, also, that's going to explain. So you were talking about God's desires too. And I think maybe we can explain those in these terms as well. We can just say, well, look, the reason God wants some things more than others is because some things are better than others. And we've already seen that because God is perfect, he knows everything. So he knows which things are better than others. And because he's a perfect being, he's always going to desire things to the extent that they're good. And so that's going to explain why God makes the decisions he makes. Now, maybe you'll say, yeah, well, maybe there's something like that for the universal wave function. And I mean, yeah, there could be, I guess. But I just sort of I feel more comfortable with the theistic explanation because I can sort of see what that underlying explanation is. Like, it's God's perfection. And I can't really see what it would be for the wave function. Although, again, I'm not a physicist.
Right. So maybe we should move on to one more objection to this argument. And maybe we'll just cover 2 theistic arguments instead of 3, because we're probably going pretty long for this one. But just, okay. So another possible objection to this argument, which I'm curious to hear your thoughts on, is why can't we just adequately explain contingent things just by appeal to some kind of infinite regress, right? So like, I exist because my parents existed and, engaged in certain kinds of activities that, led to my existence. Similarly with their parents and so on. And we just trace this back and it goes on ad infinitum, like earlier states of the universe cause later states. So we do in fact have an explanation for every contingent thing, right? Like every contingent thing is dependent on a prior contingent thing, which itself is explained by a prior contingent thing. Notice that no contingent thing goes unexplained in this scenario, right? Mm-hmm. Each contingent thing has an explanation. And I mean, maybe you'll say something like, well, we still need an explanation for like all of them together or something, but I don't know. Like if I come into a room and I see, 4 pencils on the table and I explain why each individual pencil is on the table, it seems like I've done all the explaining that there needs to be done, right? There's nothing further that needs to be explained. Like, oh, well, why are they like all there? It's like, no, I've already explained why this one is there and this one is there and that one is there. And boom, that kind of automatically explains why even the whole collection. And likewise, if I posit this infinite regress of contingent things, it seems like I've explained everything that there needs to be explained, and no appeal need be made to this ghostly necessary being that transcends the universe.
Yeah, I think I have a thought on this.
Okay.
So I think there's a relevant disanalogy between the pencil case and the how do we explain the infinite chain case. So, because insofar as we're granting that you need to appeal to this infinite chain in order to address the cosmological argument. So, like, let's grant the rest of the argument. In particular, let's grant that you accept that every contingent thing needs an explanation. It seems like in the pencil case, you might give some kind of explanation for the location of each pencil, and then, admittedly, then we have all the explanation we need. We don't need, in addition, some further explanation of why all 4 pencils would be pulled. But it seems like in the infinite chain case, you still have to admit that, like, which infinite chain of contingent things explained by more contingent things exists. It seems like a contingent fact that we have one chain that goes infinitely far back as opposed to another.
Yeah, like, so this reminds me of an example from the philosopher G.W. Leibniz. And maybe he was having a similar thought to Flo. Leibniz said, look, suppose that you have a copy of Euclid's Elements, it's a geometry book, and you want to explain where it came from. Well, you could say it was copied from a previous instance of Euclid's Elements, which was copied from an earlier copy, which was copied from an early copy. And maybe you could have an explanation of every copy in terms of other copies. But then you would have to ask, yeah, but why do we have copies of Euclid's Elements
And it was my book.
Yeah, instead of copies of the vastly superior existential inertia and classical theistic proofs. Yeah, like why don't we have infinitely many of Joe's books rather than infinitely many of Leibniz's books? It doesn't seem like you can explain that just by pointing to more copies of Euclid's Elements.
Yeah, I think that captures exactly what I was saying.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a good response. One potential way to go in response is to say, I mean, like, hey, the theist is ultimately bottoming out their explanatory chain in some kind of necessary fact. Like, it's necessary that God exists or something like that. And maybe what I'm just going to have to do here is, at least if I want to run this objection and not go with Flo's objection, maybe what I'm going to have to do here is to say, no, actually, there couldn't have been a different infinite chain. Like, it had to be this infinite chain. Even though maybe each particular member of the chain could have failed to exist, maybe there couldn't have failed to have been that infinite chain. I don't know, but that's maybe a good objection or a good response to it. I'd have to think more about that. But let's turn to another. Let's hear another argument for theism.
Okay, wow.
Give us your best shot.
Okay, here's the best one I can think of. Okay, this is sometimes called the fine-tuning argument for theism, and it's a kind of design argument. So it turns out that in the last few decades, physicists have discovered that certain features of the physical world are fine-tuned for the existence of living organisms like us. And in particular, they think the initial conditions of the universe and some of the constants that show up in the laws of physics are fine-tuned in this way. So I'll just give you one example. And this example comes from Luke Barnes, who's a physicist who did his PhD at Cambridge University. And Barnes points out that let me say what the cosmological constant is before I explain how it's fine-tuned. So the cosmological constant is a number that determines the rate of expansion of the universe. So our universe is constantly expanding. It's blowing up like a big balloon. And the cosmological constant is the number that tells us how fast the expansion is happening. Now, it turns out that, according to Barnes, and many other physicists agree with him about this, if the cosmological constant had been just a little bit less, or just a little bit lesser, or just a little bit greater, it would have prevented most of the physical structure we see around us from coming to exist. So if the cosmological constant had been just a little bit higher, everything in the early universe would have flown apart so fast that particles wouldn't have combined together to form elements like carbon, right? The universe would have just been a big, like, diffuse soup of hydrogen and helium. And, it's really hard to see how you could get life in a universe that was just a big soup of hydrogen and helium. Now, on the other hand, if the cosmological constant were a little bit smaller, the universe would have expanded for a second and then collapsed back in on itself. And that would have been it. History would have lasted for 1 second. Now, I think it's instructive to think about how precisely this value is fine-tuned. So Barnes, and again, other physicists agree with him, think that the cosmological constant is fine-tuned to 1 part in 10 to the power of 90. That's 10 with 90 zeros after it. So that's, in other words, if you were to pick a random value for the cosmological constant, the chances that that value would be consistent with the existence of life is 1 in a billion, 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 billion. And if you add there are lots of other examples of fine-tuning too. If you add all those to the mix, the numbers get even crazier. So, to quote the physicist Richard Feynman, who's one of the early discoverers of fine-tuning, it really looks like a super intellect has monkeyed with physics to make it possible for organisms like us to exist. And I kind of think that's right. It does seem that way. How are we going to explain the fact that the universe is fine-tuned for the existence of beings like us? Well, I mean, I can see why God might want beings like us to exist, right? There are lots of great things about us. But on the other hand, it's hard for me to see how, if God doesn't exist, we would have gotten so lucky. right? It seems like if God doesn't exist, then it's just a freak accident that we live in a universe where life can exist. And again, it would have to be a really improbable accident. So I think theism is looking pretty good in light of this evidence.
Well, that's very interesting. Let's see what you make of this objection. So this is called the multiverse objection, and I think it's a pretty forceful objection to the fine-tuning argument. So it seems like we can come up with an alternative explanation for why the constants and initial conditions of our universe fall within a super narrow life-permitting range, why we, as it were, hit the cosmic jackpot that doesn't appeal to theism, an explanation that doesn't appeal to theism. And the explanation is that, well, I mean, perhaps there just is a vast, maybe infinite collection of universes, the multiverse, each with different initial conditions and values of the constants in the laws of nature, most of which will be life hostile, right? They won't allow for life to develop. But since you have gazillions upon gazillions of universes here, which differ by chance in their initial conditions and, the values of their constants, it's almost guaranteed that you'll get some that actually are life permitting. And of course, which universe would we find ourselves in? Well, of course, the ones that are actually conducive to life, right? So at least if we take on the multiverse hypothesis, which it's actually taken quite seriously, and by physicists, there's certainly no consensus that this is the case, but eternal inflation cosmological models with bubble universes are taken extremely seriously by a large number of physicists. String theory is a little bit more fringe in physics, but it's still a live research program, and that also involves positing a multiverse. My point is just that this is not some ad hoc crazy posit to try to avoid the consequences of theism. Instead, it seems to be quite an elegant alternative explanation for why we hit the cosmic jackpot, which doesn't appeal to God's existence.
Interesting. So, I'm having a little bit of trouble seeing how we can explain why this universe in particular is fine-tuned by saying that there are a bunch of other universes out there. So to help you see what I'm getting at, imagine that we are playing poker together in a casino, and I get dealt 12 royal flushes in a row, and you start to suspect that I'm cheating, and you say, look, Noah, you're stacking the deck. No one gets dealt 12 royal flushes in a row. And I stop and I point out, well, Joe, look, cosmologists have said that there's an infinite multiverse out there. And probably there are countless duplicates of Noah and Joe playing poker across the multiverse. And, with so many games of poker going on at any one time, I mean, one of them's bound to have 12 royal flushes dealt in a row. I don't think you would find that very convincing. I think you would say, let's accept this crazy story you're telling, Noah. I'm not saying your explanation is crazy, but infinite poker games sounds kind of crazy. Let's take this story you're telling. That still doesn't explain why you got 12 royal flushes in a row. That's what makes me think that you're cheating. It's not just that someone somewhere got 12 royal flushes in a row. It's that you did just now. And similarly, I might say, the evidence we had isn't just that there's some universe somewhere that's fine-tuned for life. It's that this universe, the one we're in, this one right here, is fine-tuned for life. And I just don't see how a multiverse would explain that.
So I'm having a little bit of trouble seeing the analogy, because I feel like we could say, in the case of poker, let's suppose that there's all of these poker games going on in the multiverse. It seems like still we can say that the proportion of them that have people getting a bunch of royal flushes in a row is minuscule, right? So the probability that we're going to find ourselves in a universe where your friend gets the 12 royal flushes is minuscule. But given that there is a multiverse where, all the possibilities for the constants obtain, well, it seems like no matter how rare life is for various particular universes, it seems like no matter how rare that is, still the probability that we're going to find ourselves in such a universe is one. Because I can't find myself in the universe without I.
Yeah, this is called a selection effect. So it seems like maybe in the case that you provided, there's no selection effect. I really could have found myself with a Noah who isn't cheating, right? But I couldn't have found myself in one of those non-life permitting universes. So it's just rephrasing Flo's point.
Yeah. That's interesting. I'll have to think more about that. It still seems to me like what needs explaining isn't just that I find myself in some fine-tuned universe or other, but that this particular universe is fine-tuned. But I don't really have. I don't think I've got an argument that's going to convince you to see things that way. Maybe I'll think of one.
Can I?
Yeah.
Maybe we can modify this example in your favor.
Uh-huh.
So, let's say that,
Yeah.
let's say that I find out that my parents decided they only wanted to have me have a child if they get 12 royal flushes in a row. So I could have never found myself in a universe where there weren't these 12 royal flushes in a row on this particular occasion, right? So it seems like it's analogous in that respect. But it still seems like wild to me, even if we assume this universe, that I shouldn't assume that there was cheating going on as opposed to having the multiverse explanation. So yeah, I couldn't have found myself in a universe where there weren't the 12 royal flushes happening in a row. So I think it still seems just as weird as your initial case. And now we've sort of accounted for the idea that I couldn't have found myself in another kind of universe.
I can't believe I'm saying this, but I don't know if that analogy works, which is sort of weird because it helps my side, but I feel like I should still explain what I'm thinking to make sure we don't get this wrong. So in the case you described, I mean, you only could have had one set of parents because anyone with parents other than yours just wouldn't have been you.
Right.
And if your parents only played poker once, then you only had one chance to get 12 royal flushes. But if Joe is right, and there's a huge multiverse, then there were lots and lots of chances to get a fine-tuned universe. And so it's more like if your parents had played poker a trillion to the power of a trillion times.
Oh yeah, so I'm still imagining we have a multiverse. In my example. So but I mean, then weird claims about my essence come into being could I have found myself in another universe with qualitatively identical parents? Or are they different parents? And so that wouldn't be me, it would be a duplicate of me.
Yeah, maybe in the same way.
Let's close off this part of the discussion because that's getting the technical weeds. But maybe one other objection to the fine-tuning argument, which is just doesn't this seem kind of anthropomorphic? Why would God be interested in us? I mean, we're pretty crappy beings. I don't know. And I mean, why would God be interested in life? I mean, God could have created anything. He's omnipotent, right? He could have just, created some, a world where it's just a duck and it just quacks.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's what he could have created where it's just octagons all over the place. Just octagons. He's all powerful. He could do that, right? So the possibilities are infinite. So it seems super low probability that God would create create a world where the constants fall within a narrow life permitting range and all that stuff.
And yeah, and could I add even if you say it's good to create people, because it seems like we're the condition for any moral value that exists, so it makes sense that God might want to create us. But he could have created non-physical people. Many religious people think he did in fact create angels. Why didn't he just create angels? What are the chances he would want to make physical life with fine-tuned constants and so on?
Yeah. Good question. So for some of the reasons you pointed out, I don't think it's right to say that we can know that if God existed, he definitely would create a universe just like this one. A universe just like this one doesn't seem very likely given God's existence. But I think the problem is that it seems even less likely, dramatically less likely if God doesn't exist. And it can still be evidence for the existence of God in that case. So let me give you an analogy. Let's suppose that after this debate, I go back to the student lounge and I walk in and I see on the table there are some Scrabble tiles. And they spell, "Happy Thursday, Noah." from flow. And I try to think, oh, what could explain this message? Here's one explanation. Flo wanted to leave me a message. Now, it's not very likely that Flo would leave me this message, because first of all, like, who says happy Thursday? And second, it's not even Thursday. It's Wednesday. So that's definitely not the message I would expect if I thought that Flo had left me a message. But still, I mean, isn't that still a much more likely explanation than that the Scrabble tiles like randomly fell out of the box and just like arranged themselves into the message, happy Thursday, Noah, from Flo? Like, so I think maybe the fine-tuning argument works in a similar way. It doesn't require that God would be very likely to create a universe with just the kind of life that in fact exists here. It just has to assume that God is more likely, that it's more likely that God would create this kind of life than that this kind of life would emerge just by chance.
Yeah, and I mean, there does seem to be, I don't know, there do seem to be some like unique values that humans provide that like the duck world doesn't. You know, like a duck maybe can't engage in like a really meaningful relationship with God, whereas we can.
Yeah.
And like octagons are pretty pathetic.
Well, and like, I mean, who's to say God didn't create the universe with just the duck or all the octagons? I mean, he's limitless in power, right? And you seem to be a fan of multiverses, so maybe every universe that's worth creating, God just creates that universe, and maybe that includes the duck universe. Maybe it's not like, you know, the most amazing. Yeah,
I guess,
but it might be worth creating.
And I guess it just doesn't have to be like a 1 in 10 to the billion chance. That does that. Okay, I mean, I guess that's a fair response. I mean, maybe we should move on to the like atheistic arguments. I mean, how much? I know what time is it?
It's 7:51.
Okay. Well, maybe we could just go 90 minutes and then have 30 minutes of Q&A, and people could just stay and ask as long as they want. I can stay here all night.
Me too.
So maybe we'll do that.
Okay.
We'll go now.
Alrighty.
So one argument that I find really compelling for atheism is what we could call like the argument from evil, where by evil, I mean, we typically have like a more like a human action connotation with that, where it's like humans do evil, right? But really what I'm getting at is like bad things happening or suffering, things like that. So maybe we could better call it an argument from suffering. And I put the argument something like this. If God exists, then it seems like there'd be no pointless suffering. What do I mean by pointless suffering? Well, it's suffering that it's not required to bring about any like greater good. So, you know, sometimes we can allow suffering to happen, and we can be justified in doing that. Like a parent brings a child to the doctor to get the child inoculated against influenza, for instance. That seems to be permissible, even though that the parent is, you know, subjecting their child to a kind of pain and suffering. But that's because it's required to bring about a greater good, namely protection from a disease. So a good parent would do that, but it seems like a good parent would prevent unnecessary suffering befalling their children, right? Like the child is about to walk out into the street and get hit by a bus or something. The parent's going to sprint out and save the child, right? And I mean, God is like the perfect parent, right? So God's all-knowing, so he would know about all the instances of evil and suffering in the world. He's all-powerful, so he'd have the ability to prevent all the instances of evil and suffering in the world. And he's all-good, so it seems like he'd want to prevent all the instances of evil and suffering in the world. And so it seems like if he doesn't have that reason, which he doesn't have that reason to prevent the suffering, or he doesn't have that reason to allow the suffering, namely that it brings about a greater good. In other words, if the suffering does not bring about a greater good, it seems like God's going to have to prevent it. It just seems like it's required by his perfect goodness and his knowing that this doesn't lead to any greater good, so I really should prevent that. So if God exists, I think there shouldn't be any gratuitous suffering. But when we look around, it seems like there really is gratuitous suffering. It seems like pointless evil happens all the time. I mean, children are abused, they're tortured, they're dismembered to death. It doesn't seem like that brings about any greater good for the child or rest of society. Think about non-human animals. In fact, here I kind of want to read out a quote from Richard Dawkins. So Richard Dawkins in The River Out of Eden writes the following passage. The total amount of suffering per year in the natural world is beyond all decent contemplation. During the minute that it takes me to compose this sentence, thousands of animals are being eaten alive. Many others are running for their lives, whimpering with fear, and others are slowly being devoured from within by rasping parasites. Thousands of all kinds are dying of starvation, thirst, and disease. It must be so. If there ever is a time of plenty, this very fact will automatically lead to an increase in the population until the natural state of starvation and misery is restored. In a universe of electrons and selfish genes, blind physical forces, and genetic replication, and I end the quote there, that's precisely what we would expect. But in a world where God's orchestrating things, it seems like he's created an evolutionary process where, in order to bring about biological diversity in humans, he's had to basically like have animals rip each other to shreds and starve and die. And I mean, this is inherent to his very mechanism of creation. His very means of creation was suffering and death of innocent, non-human animals. And it seems like a providential being, a perfectly good providential being, would not orchestrate reality like that. Because that seems to be pointless suffering. I mean, think about what God could have done. He could have shortened the evolutionary process. He could have created in 6,000 years, like some people think. He could have made herbivores or creatures that, get their energy from the sun or get their energy from the atmosphere. But no, they must rip each other to shreds in a bloodbath. Mm-hmm. So I really do think it's quite plausible that gratuitous suffering exists. And if God exists, it seems like there wouldn't be gratuitous suffering. And so it seems like God doesn't exist.
Ooh. Well, yeah, I have to admit that this kind of argument does bother me.
And I will, in fairness, I will admit that the fine-tuning argument bothers me. If I have to posit, an infinite multiverse, maybe I'm feeling a little bit uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But anyway.
Well, so the argument does bother me. I can see the force of the argument, but I'll just try to give you what I think the theist should say. So, first of all, I think oftentimes when we really look carefully at what seem like gratuitous evils, we can find explanations for why they're necessary for some greater good. Like in the example you gave with the child getting a shot at the doctor. But I admit that in some cases, it's really hard to see what the greater good could possibly be. Like, for example, why have an ecosystem full of predators and prey rather than just an ecosystem full of, photosynthesizing creatures that live in perfect harmony? And I think what the theist should say about this is, it's not obvious that if these things did serve some greater good, it would be obvious to us what those greater goods are. And I think your parent analogy actually illustrates this nicely. A perfect parent would take their very young child to the doctor. And the perfect parent would have good reasons for taking the child to the doctor. But the child, being a child, isn't going to be able to understand why they're there. Even if the parent tried to explain, they would fail, right? Because the child just doesn't have the cognitive capacity to understand, what's at stake. And I think it's very plausible that we're in the same situation with regards to God. I mean, Stephen Weikstra is a philosopher who believes in God, who's written a lot about the problem of evil. And he points out, look, if the difference in the wisdom and understanding of an infant and a parent is enough for the infant, right, to not be privy to all the parent's reasons, well, just compare that to the distance between God's wisdom and understanding and our wisdom and understanding. It seems like it's vastly greater. So I think that even if God did have good reasons for permitting the kinds of suffering that you're talking about, I don't have any reason to think that I'd be able to grasp them. And, the world is a complicated place. Everything's interconnected. I'm not an ecologist, but my understanding is ecology is very, very complicated. And so, for all we know, there couldn't have been a planet with just photosynthesizing animals, or maybe that planet would have been worse in lots of other ways that we wouldn't expect. I'm not saying that I know that for sure, or that I can give you any argument for that view. I'm just pointing out that, maybe we should be less confident that there could be a world like that, or that world will be better than the one we in fact have.
I mean, do you want to have anything as a residential agnostic? I mean, I could respond to that, but maybe I should wait until the agnostic has her say.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like, on the one hand, it's hard, just like your examples of like the animals dying, like a fawn dying in a forest fire, these poor animals getting devoured by parasites until they finally perish. Those seem really hard to explain with these greater good analogies, but I mean, just to like throw out a proposal, even for that case, like, who's to say an animal might not get an eternal afterlife or something like that? Like, if we think in the case of a human, like, it's not super implausible to me that like a lot of the hardships I've been through, might eventually be something where I look back and say, this was all worth it in the end. Even an animal, if they have like an eternal afterlife, like, it seems pretty likely to me that there might be a way that this afterlife might be of such a nature that this suffering will be redeemed, and that if the animal were capable of thinking about this, they would look back and think it was all worth it.
I suppose, yeah.
And,
Good. Yeah.
And eventually, like, these few years of bad suffering, that's just going to be a blip in the animal's whole life and this eternal afterlife. Like,
I mean, I suppose, that wouldn't be too difficult for like an omnipotent being to pull off.
yeah.
Well, let me go back to Noah's point and see if I can respond to that. I mean, one worry that I have for that is, seems like we could say that no matter how much, give your response no matter how much suffering there was. Like, we look at reality, it's just a pure torture world. Like, every single being for all of eternity, just being like tortured like for billions of years. Like, somehow things are sustaining it and keeping it alive. And this is true for like billions of creatures. So much different than, the actual world. But like, it seems like this response would work in that world. Like, oh, God's so wise. He's got a plan. I don't know. It just seems like in that world, surely the character of that world should be powerful evidence against God's existence. But like, if your response were correct, that world wouldn't be powerful evidence against God's existence. At least that's how it seems to me.
Yeah, and it's like, if any state of affairs I could observe or imagine, like, doesn't count as contradicting a hypothesis, it's kind of hard to see, like, what the hypothesis even means. Like,
Yeah,
that's a good point. So maybe the response I gave isn't enough to totally get rid of the force of the argument from suffering. Maybe if there was enough suffering, or if there were certain kinds of suffering, it would just be so bad that even our uncertainty about what God's reasons are wouldn't be enough to sort of make theism plausible. But maybe it does go some way towards softening the force of the argument. I mean, maybe what I can say is, look, the world is pretty good, at least as far as I can see. And as we talked about before, unlike in the world you described, many of this, or much of the suffering, rather, that occurs in our world, we kind of can see some reasons for why a God might permit that suffering. And so I think you're right that it would be bad if I said, well, look, because God is so much wiser than us, no evil can ever be evidence against the existence of God, because that would mean the torture world wouldn't be evidence, and that does seem wrong to me. So I think I should grant you that your argument it does provide some evidence against theism, but for some of the reasons I described and for some of the reasons Flo was considering, I just don't think it's convincing enough evidence for me to overturn the force of arguments like the two we were talking about earlier.
Yeah. I mean, maybe, so there are, of course, we could go back and forth quite a lot on this, but maybe we can go to one more argument that I have in my quiver for atheism. And it's what some people have called divine hiddenness, but maybe I can just call it the sincere seeker argument. So let's define a sincere seeker as someone who really is open to belief in God. Like, they really are open to a relationship with God. Maybe they want a relationship with God. But yet they find themselves either just unconvinced that God exists. So maybe they find themselves with non-belief. So either they're agnostic or they're atheist. Or maybe they are theists, but they just have such a radically mistaken conception of God that they just have a very poor relation. They maybe either don't relate to God because they're just so mistaken about God, given their religious beliefs or whatever, because God is some particular way, and the different world religions contradict one another in pretty fundamental tenets about what God is like and how we are to relate to God. So a lot of these people are just like fundamentally mistaken about how they are to relate to God and how they are to behave in their lives in relation to God and religious questions. So these people, and many of them are sincere, like they're really open to being corrected, to having the correct religious views. And they even might want to believe in God, but might also want to have the correct kind of religious orientation. But they just, either through sociocultural accident or through just being unconvinced by the arguments, they just find themselves unable to believe in God. These are kind of sincere seekers. It's not the case that they like fail to believe in God or fail to appropriately relate to God as a result of their own like moral corruption or their own resistance to God, like they hate God or anything like that. No, they really are open, and they really are seeking, and they really are perhaps even desiring. But yet they haven't seemed to have found God, or at least they don't yet seem to appropriately relate to God. And many people even die in this kind of condition, this state of their life. So that's what a sincere seeker is. Now, it seems like if God exists, then there shouldn't really be sincere seekers who never find God, who never come to belief in God, and who never come to kind of somehow appropriately relate to him. Because God is a relational being, it seems. He's perfectly good. It seems like if God's going to create conscious beings who can think about God, who can seemingly relate to him, it seems like God would want to have that kind of relationship with us. He'd be perfectly loving, and love desires the good of another. And what is better than having a relationship with your perfect creator? And so it seems like God would be strongly motivated to reach out to people who are open to him, who aren't resistant to him. Now, if people are like morally corrupted, they have a choice. Like maybe they can choose to reject God and they could just walk away. Sure, this argument doesn't apply to them, though that wouldn't be a sincere seeker. But it seems like God would try to reach out to people who would be sincere seekers were it not for God reaching out to them and establishing a relationship or some kind of awareness of God's existence. But yet, it seems God hasn't done that because there are many sincere seekers. So the argument here is that if God exists, there wouldn't be any sincere seekers who never find God. But there are sincere seekers who never find God, and so God doesn't exist.
Well, I think I want to grant your premise that there are sincere seekers.
Who never find God, right?
Who never find God. Yeah, that's right. I think I know people like that. So I'm going to have to explain in some way why, despite the fact that they're sincerely seeking after God, they never find him. Well, here's an idea. There's something really good about what we're doing right now. I mean, suppose that I really did convince you and Flo that God exists. Seems like that would be amazing. That would be a valuable experience for all of us. Maybe that would
assuming that God exists, because
Oh, right, that's right. Yes, which of course I am assuming.
No, but what I want to say is you're giving a response from how the theist can explain the existence of sincere seekers. So it's fine for you to say, well, listen, if God really does exist, there is great value in theists helping to try to convince other people and help share relationship with God.
Yeah. Couldn't have said it better myself.
I'm trying to steel man you, man.
Oh, I appreciate that. This is how I know you're a sincere seeker. So that's one valuable thing that maybe we couldn't have if God immediately revealed himself to everyone who seeks him, right? Because then, there wouldn't really be a lot of work left over for us to do. There wouldn't be many ways for us to participate. That's one possibility. Here's another possibility. Maybe God has to remain somewhat hidden in order for us to be free, to live our lives in the way we choose so that we don't feel like we're being coerced. I mean, this reminds me of that TV show, Undercover Boss, right? Where the boss goes and hangs out with their employees, but, they want to see what their employees are actually like day to day, so they disguise themselves, right? And maybe that's the way God treats us. Maybe he disguises himself so that we can sort of live our lives sincerely. We can really be who we are rather than being intimidated or coerced by his constant presence.
Yeah, so I'm not sure the level at which God has to be present in order for sincere seekers to be able to find him. Is sort of the same level at which it would sort of take away our free will or make us feel like he's constantly hovering over us. Consider this analogy. I'm pretty sure my mom exists, right?
Yeah.
Now, on the one hand, if it were the case that she was sort of like omnipresent, constantly watching what I do, maybe through cameras everywhere, my life would be sort of, I wouldn't have much agency. I'd be constantly worried about what she's doing. But like, I still have like definitive empirical evidence based on my personal experience that she's real. And that doesn't seem to sort of like rule out that I have any sort of like agency that I practice. And
Yeah, so I think the argument would only like require me to have a belief in God, right? Not that God's like always experientially present, like he's hovering over my shoulder, right? I mean, like even theists, they do bad things sometimes, right? So like evidently they believe in God, but that doesn't take away their freedom, it seems, right? So like why would it take away my freedom if I were to come to believe in God's existence?
That's pretty convincing. Yeah. I think,
But I mean, well, what if, I guess one thing, see, I'm now having doubts about my own objection there. I mean, it's like, because what if I'm like different than other people such that like maybe my freedom actually would be impugned in some way until I've cultivated the right sort of dispositions or something like that. Like maybe like some portion of the population actually doesn't need the belief, whereas others do in order to be. Anyway.
So maybe it's something about your personal psychology, or maybe it's not the right time for God to reveal himself.
Right. Oh, and I mean,
maybe he will in the afterlife.
Yeah, like what if there's a view about the afterlife that lots of theologians subscribe to called universalism. And universalism just says that although God might not have a relationship with everyone in this life, eventually everyone's going to have a relationship with God because he's a perfect being and he's not going to stop, trying to relate to us. And so maybe, if God really did exist, then, and there really could be an afterlife, like Flo was suggesting before, then it seems like, we can't say, maybe here's the problem. One of the premises of your argument was that there are sincere seekers who never find God. But all we really know is that there are some sincere seekers who die without finding God. But it might be that those sincere seekers, although they do die without finding God, they nevertheless eventually find God, like after they've died. To say they never find God, I don't know. Can we really know that?
I have a kind of out there proposal. Like, maybe the sincere seekers are in a way in a relationship with God.
how?
Let's like, so it just occurred to me this, so The Last Battle by C.S. Lewis.
Yeah.
So there's a part in it where a narrator says, he's been on the side of Tash, the bad guy in the book, doing all these things, helping him carry out all this evil, and he was so diligent and loyal to the evil Tash. But eventually he realizes the truth. He realizes that Tash is evil and that Aslan is the true good one that he should have been following this whole time. So, he goes up to Aslan and says, to experience you once and die is better than to not experience you at all. But I completely understand that I need to pay for the consequences of my actions, my service of Tash. And so do what you will now. And Aslan says he's not going to punish Tash. He's going to say that your diligence and all of your oath-keeping, everything good you did was out of sincere service of duty. And everything that you did for Tash, I hereby count in my name.
That sounds very similar, actually, to something that Jesus says in the Gospel of Matthew. He says, not all who say to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but those who do the will of my Father who is in heaven. And then he says that if you fed the hungry or clothed the naked or visited those who were in prison, even if you didn't know that you were actually doing those things to Jesus himself. He said, whatever you did to the least of these, my brothers, you've done it to me as well. And so maybe these sincere seekers, they really are relating to God by relating to other people or in some other way.
By following the good.
Right, yeah, exactly.
Well, that's a pretty convincing response. I mean, I guess the only way that I could try to push back, I mean, honestly, that's pretty powerful. But what I would maybe do here is say that like that's sure, maybe they're relating to God. Maybe the sincere seekers do have a relationship with God in this life and they just don't know it. But like, wouldn't it be more valuable if they actually did have a conscious relationship with God so that they like believed in God's existence and could like follow him better in this life? I mean, after all, you are proposing this as a kind of temporary stage on the journey towards being in a conscious relationship with God, which seems to be the more valuable end state. So why not just start with that if it's more valuable? Why go through this circuitous route that seems to be suboptimal, right? That might be my best shot, but I mean, that's like the response I've heard to the hiddenness argument or the sincere seeker argument. I mean, that's great.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. I don't know why God might do it that way. Maybe here I should fall back to, sort of the suggestion I was making earlier. Maybe there's something especially valuable about, coming to know God gradually or knowing him in a sort of indirect way.
Right, like maybe
you just can't.
maybe like, the atheist's self-sacrifice, jumping on the grenade for their friends is all the more meaningful because it's not done in anticipation of an afterlife.
Of a reward.
Yeah.
So
It's like maybe Kant said, moral worth comes from acting from duty, not just doing the right thing, but doing the right thing because it's right.
okay, well now you're convincing me that my argument fails.
Well, I still got the argument from evil.
It's like 15 after now, so I wonder if it's time for me to make my case.
Yeah. Okay. Fine.
So you all only got to make 2 arguments, but I think I can quickly run through 1 and do 2, because you all made the first argument for me, actually. So, I mean, just to say my position, I think like there's such strong arguments on both sides, and they both seem to count really heavily in favor of both sides of this issue. And, I'm not saying like, oh, there's no fact of the matter, like, it's maybe subjective opinion whether God exists or not. Like, no, I think God really either does exist or doesn't exist. But I just think, given all the evidence we have, we can't know. The appropriate thing to do is to suspend judgment. If I wake up in the morning and like I haven't looked outside, I'm not going to say there's no fact of the matter as to whether it's raining. I'm going to say, I don't know yet. I can't form a belief either way. So, and it really seems to me that the arguments are extremely compelling on both sides and very uncertain. Like, on the one hand, the fine-tuning arguments seem very powerful. It seems like there's a very low probability that a universe like ours would end up being one that supports life, although it's unclear whether, like, the multiverse objection works. And the problem of evil, like, it still seems pretty compelling to me. Like, I really, really feel like I could make some at least tiny adjustments to this universe that would make it a little better without any downsides. But of course, I can't, like, know that for certain for the sorts of reasons you stated. And, I mean, yeah, so I guess I might go on to sort of a more general argument. I think the fact that not only us, but philosophers of religion all disagree with each other after so much time and so much careful evaluation of all of the evidence, that they come to different conclusions. I think that's a pretty good argument for the fact that the appropriate thing to do is to suspend judgment. Like, let me give an analogy. I read it in a paper that was about disagreement. So let's say that myself and Joe are at a restaurant. We both order the same thing. So our meals come out to cost the same, right?
Which is, of course, vegan. Right.
Of course. As is morally required. So we're calculating our tips, and I say, okay, tip is $2.53. And then Joe's like, no, I got $3.51. And I'm like, okay, one of us made a mistake. So I go back, check my calculations. I try really carefully. Everything's right. And I'm like, no, definitely $2.53. And Joe's like, wait, I just checked it really carefully. It's definitely $3.51. So we check again. And then I so meticulously check my calculation. And I've never been more confident in an arithmetical fact that I am that this tip comes out to 253. And that's what I get. And then Joe, Joe says, come on, I've done a fair amount of math. Like, I've never been more confident that 1.2 times something is 351. It seems like, if I'm being reasonable, I recognize the fact that we both want the truth in this case. It's not like Joe's just trying to mess with me. And we're both equally good at arithmetic. And, we both have the same evidence. We're looking at, the exact same bill. Let's say we check that. Given those things, it seems like if I'm honestly being, just like appropriately responding to all the evidence, what I'm going to do is I'm not going to say like, well, I checked, I'm pretty sure I'm right. No, I'm going to say, like, I think I should suspend judgment. I think it seems equally likely that I made a mistake that I missed when meticulously checking my calculation. Is equally likely as that Joe did the same. And so this really seems like a case analogous to the Tiff case. Like, philosophers had been throwing back and forth all these arguments for and against God's existence for so long, and they put so much effort into this, and they all seem to share some important properties. They're going off the same evidence. They're all equally, at least many of them, many people on both sides, are equally intellectually virtuous and genuine in seeking the truth. And they're all epistemic peers, so to speak. They're peers. It's not like people on one side are more of an expert than the people on the other side. So it seems like, just like in the Tip case, the right thing to do in this situation is to say, I should not believe in God. I should not believe God does not exist. The evidence doesn't sufficiently establish either conclusion.
Okay, that's an interesting case. But, like, it seems like you're relying on some sort of general principle here, and it's something like, when peers disagree over something, then we should, like, suspend judgment on it, or something like that.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Okay, so I think that can't be true, because just apply that principle to itself, right? I mean, epistemologists disagree about this very principle. There are some people who think that when you come across disagreement like this, no, you should just stand firm to your guns, and you shouldn't conciliate, as it were, to the other person.
Yeah, you should be intellectually courageous, right? You should stand up for your view,
right? And maybe, like, it's just a fundamental principle of epistemology that we should just trust ourselves and our own modes of inquiry and whatnot over others, at least without sufficient evidence contrary to that. Mm-hmm. So a lot of philosophers actually reject this principle, who don't advocate for this kind of peer disagreement, approach to peer disagreement. And so what that means is that if we apply this principle to itself, it would tell us that we should suspend judgment on it, right? Because there are peers who disagree about whether the principle is true. And the principle says when peers disagree about whether something is true, then you should suspend judgment on it. Okay, so the principle says of itself that I should suspend judgment on it, in which case I shouldn't accept it. The principle is like, don't accept me. Like, I'm a terrible principle. Like, it's as if I said, like, there is no truth. Well, if that is true, then there's truth. So it's like self-defeated. So, like, your principle, if you had it, it's like, hey, don't believe me. Like, anyway, that's my worry.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I need to, like, narrow my principle down a little bit. So I think if we state the principle, like, if peers disagree about a matter, then they should both suspend judgment. Yeah, at that level of generality, it seems defeating. Seems self-defeating.
Yeah.
But, at the very least, to me, it seems like in the receipt case, it is rational to suspend judgment.
Yeah, I say I do have a situation.
Yeah. I mean, let me... Whereas in other cases, it's not rational to suspend judgment. I might, have a view in a certain philosophical topic, even though I know some of my epistemic peers disagree with me on that view. But I sort of feel like the case of the existence of God is a lot more like the receipt case than it is about the truth of motivational internalism or something. It's like, just because of how old the literature is, how well investigated almost all the arguments are. I mean, some are a lot newer, but I think a lot of the main ones with the most force are sort of like very well investigated, and people still come out on both sides. Like, I think a narrower version of this sort of principle I proposed could be right. One where, like, if we restrict ourselves to the cases of like very old disagreements where things have been thoroughly investigated, but epistemic peers still come out disagreeing, then you should suspend judgment.
Yeah. I mean, that principle itself may not be self-defeating then.
Because the literature is not that old.
Right, because epistemologists have only been discussing the topic of peer disagreement for like
The 2010s, right?
yeah, it's very recent. It's that literature is younger than me, you know. So
Yeah, well, I guess we can. Well, after maybe you and I give brief thoughts on this response, then we can turn it over to Q&A. But I'm just thinking, like, I don't know. When I consider the arguments, they do just seem to very compellingly point to the atheist conclusion. The problem of evil seems very powerful, and I think that there are sufficient moves that one can make to at least diminish the force of the fine-tuning argument. Maybe it doesn't get rid of it entirely, but just think like when we examine the first order evidence, it seems like it at least very plausibly points to one direction. So I guess maybe that's one way that I respond. But
and maybe, of course, I have the same perspective, but in the opposite direction. And maybe that's just because there are differences between the kinds of arguments or the kinds of explanations that different people find plausible. And maybe that's just an unavoidable fact about the kinds of reasoners that we are, right? It might be that, when I think of the idea of a perfect being, it seems so simple and like such a powerful explanation. And when Joe thinks of the concept of a perfect being at the foundation of reality, he thinks, I'm just not seeing it. And maybe when Joe considers all the suffering in the world, it just seems so forceful to him. And I grant it does seem forceful to me, but maybe just because of, my idiosyncrasies, I'm just more optimistic that it's ultimately explicable, even if we don't know or aren't able to grasp what the explanation is. And I think, in that situation, it's like Joe said, the best we can do is go with what we've got. Take the methods of inquiry that are available to us and do our best with the resources that we have.
Okay, well, let's turn over to Q&A. So, how's this?